Okay, so welcome everybody. This is another session. This one's actually, I believe, session 5. We have a session 4 that is recorded that we will add in also to the series of RJ that presented on DataWeave, which was great, and also Manny presented on Batch. And that was awesome too. So those two objectives will be covered in session 4. So I will have that one uploaded as soon as possible. So you'll be able to have that one as well. So this one's session 5, and the session today is on error handling. So what I have for us is 3 jar files. And these jar files I have actually written blogs on. So there's some blogs associated with this. It's also what I have used for coaching to help people get through and understand error handling. And it's also going to be released in the book that I'm writing that has gone to the publisher. So that should be out too. So you're going to see some of this also in the book, Building Integrations with MuleSoft. So anyway, the 3 jar files that I have here, they're labeled, the path for the listener is example 1, example 2, and each one has a little bit of a different scenario and every different option of to really give you an understanding of how error handling is managed in Mule flows. Okay, so this is kind of like, if you're an artist, this is kind of like your brush and paint. So then you will take what you've learned here and you will apply it to an error handling strategy. Okay, so this is part 1. Today is part 1. Thursday is part 2. Part 2 is what I want to have you, I'm going to give you the brushes and the canvas, and we're going to go over some details of how it behaves. And then part 2 is going to be based on applying error handling to your applications or how you would do your error handling strategy and what would be best in different situations. So that will be our agenda for Thursday. So any takers on, who want to jump in there for error handling strategy and applying it to applications, that's the real world usage. Okay. And you can even use the questions from the practice exam and do a demo on those, kind of like Manny did with the batch job. So you can do that with the error handling questions on the practice exam. Okay. But I'm going to go ahead and put each of these jar files. Let me export each of these. And I will put them in. Let me just run them to my desktop for right now real quick. I will go ahead and get these in our Slack folder for right now. And then you can, anyone who's watching the video, if you don't have access to our Slack folder, let me know. We'll get this to you. But above all, so that you have these as examples. And once you have them, you can change them and do whatever you want and add various things. So essentially what is here, like I said, are various flows. And I'm using the raise error operation. If you look at 4 over here, you can see you've got the error handler, the on error continue and on error propagate scopes, and then the raise error operation. So this raise error operation gives you the ability to throw an error purposefully in a flow. Now, sometimes we use it architecturally as a stop the process and handle the error and do something, rerouting in a way. So we have actually used this operation, in production flows. But I use it here as an example of, throwing a flow or throwing an error inside of a flow. So I'm going to go through each of these. Let me grab the next one. We've got one also that is at the flow level. So you're going to see various components of this. Export there. So go ahead and get Studio up so that you can run these along with us. Here we go. And they're coming in Slack now. Got too many windows open over here. Hold on a second. Okay, it's almost there. There's that one. It'll probably take just a few minutes. They're not huge files, but it may take just a few minutes for it to totally load. And then the last one is the global. Okay. As soon as that one is ready, we'll go ahead and get them to you. I do have them in GitHub, but the version that's in GitHub needs to be updated. So we'll just go with sharing it locally like this. And yeah, definitely feeling like I'm needing that third monitor. There we go. Okay. So, like I said, our agenda today, go ahead and grab those, download them, import them into Studio so that you can be following along or be working with it, as just, as you're studying. So, we're going to look at for exam relevance. Okay. So this is focused for exam purposes. You do need to know the Mule default error handling processes. Like if the HTTP listener is set to default settings, what is that? Exactly how the flow is going to be managed in the event that there's no error handling at all. Somebody answer Arif in that Slack channel for me and tell him we're doing the MCD 1 training, because he's looking, he's seeing if it's for our template, and it's not. And then we have on error propagate versus on error continue. We'll talk about the differences between those. The global error handler versus our local at the flow level or even at the processor level. What happens when an error is thrown? What is created? There's actually a Mule Error Object that gets created. And if you remember when I shared the Mule event a while back, that is the Mule Error Object that is in the Mule event. Where is my picture of my Mule event? This guy. Okay, so remember I was telling you in the Mule event, there's also a place for the errors. You don't see that in a lot of the training until you're at the architect level, but there is a place in the Mule event that manages the Mule object, the Mule error object. Okay. And then the triscope is what we use when we wrap the ability to have error handling around a group of processors. It doesn't have to just be one processor. It could be multiple processors. Okay. So the idea behind it is, we want to consider exam relevance on these, and then real world relevance as well. So exam relevance are when an error, there's different kinds of errors that can occur. The errors that are at the system level are errors we really can't handle in our Mule flows because it's outside of a Mule flow. It's something that occurs, whether, it could be that, it's a flow that is overloaded, or it could be that there is, an endpoint that is totally down, or the application is having to be restarted. So there's some things that are out of our reach when it comes to error handling. Like if your Mule runtime server is down, those system errors, our flow can't do anything with those. So those are considered to be system errors. Now you can have like a reconnection strategy. You can have your applications set to have a health check and do a recovery. In Cloud Hub 2, there's a intelligent recovery process also that if a particular pod is, or a particular application within a pod is not functioning properly, it will actually trigger it to restart and redeploy it into another pod. So it's pretty interesting the way that's set up. But those are the ones that we can't do anything about. Now in Mule flows, we can manage the messaging errors. So the messaging errors are, when an error is thrown due to, various issues. For example, it could be a transform message error. It could be, something about security in regards to client ID and client secret, or that a retry that's been set has been exhausted. So there's many different types of errors that can be handled. And there's a family tree here. We've got a family tree set up to where at the highest level, we have the error type called any. That is actually an error type. Okay, and then there's a whole family of different types of errors in the family tree. So you'll see in a segment when we're talking about catching certain errors, we will give it an error type and catch that particular type of error. So more on that later. Okay. So thank you for responding to him on that. When an error occurs, two things are created, and these are part of the error object. Okay. And we have an error description and an error type. Both of these are reserved fields, reserved objects, values that are used to identify what the error is. So we can use these reserved values, error description or the error type, and we can see that they are defined in the console in our logs automatically. If we do not have any error handling set, you're going to see the error messages automatically populate as we see here. And so in this type, you can see where the error type is any. It was defined as any. And the error description is the message here that we have given the raise error. Okay, so in the raise error, when we configured this, we said when this is triggered and this error occurs, it's going to be the type any, and I could have set that to anything, but I chose any because it's a common one. And then for the description, I wrote in the error description, this is an error as a result of the raise error processor. And so that's why you're seeing this listed. Okay, so that's where it's getting it from. It is a part of the error object, completely part of the error object. So these values allow us to identify, what the error is and a description for it. Okay. Okay, so again, exam relevant, you do want to remember the default settings for your HTTP listener. So where you'll find this, of course, is when you click on your HTTP listener and you come to the responses area on the left here. These are default settings. Okay, so by default, when you have a 200 success, so the first part is the response. This is the success area. And by default, you're going to get the value of the payload. Everything's good. I went and got data and you're bringing that back. And the payload is the value that you have, that you just got from a database or whatever. So that would be the payload. And then the status code, although it's not defined here, the default value of the status code is 200. So that is going to be the default value of a success response. And then the reason phrase here, let me move this out of the way. The reason phrase is also not set to a value, but you will get a 200 success response here. Then when there's an error, the default value for an error is the output. This is, like I said, this is the default settings for an error. It's set to text plain error description. Okay. And again, no status code is identified here, so that it is going to default to 500. Now, the problem with that is if you have a bad request, like someone didn't send in a required field, or there is, an issue with credentialing, your client ID and client secret is wrong or something like that, it's going to, by default, give you a 500 status code error, which is server down. And that's not accurate. So this is where we want to provide a more meaningful error message and set that error message to return back a value that's more appropriate. Okay. So that's the listener default settings. Then we modify this. Okay. We modify it to override the HTTP status codes, as I just mentioned here, that we would want it to be something more meaningful by setting it where the error occurred. And we would also want to provide a more meaningful message in the payload instead of that error description. I mean, the error description is nice, that's fine, but maybe we want to provide it with something more specific to where this error has occurred. And so then we can override these values. These are the custom settings. So on the exam, you will have a question, and it's going to say the HTTP listener is set to the default settings. You must know this, and you must know that it's going to be a 500. The success is going to be easy to remember, but this portion is what you really want to focus on, because they're going to ask you, what's the result of this when this runs? Or, it'll give you some questions surrounding, what will your end result be? So if this is set to the default settings, you know what you're going to get here. The error description and the status code. Okay. So we use this variable here, and this variable gives us the opportunity to override that 500 and get a successful response back, or a not successful, I'm sorry. Well, you could set it to 200, but you would actually get, whatever value you want to set. And so if you were to look at, let's see, where's my system API? If you were to even look at the APIkit router, if you're like not sure, gee, what did we set those values to? If you look at the results of the APIkit router, you will see that this listener is set to the custom values. When we use our specification to create our interface for our Mule application, the APIkit router module is used to spin out our flows that we need. But in addition to that, it customizes the HTTP listener for you automatically. So you will see here that this is what we have shown already, in that we're overriding the HTTP status codes. Now it's also showing the override, using the headers. We don't get into using those headers too much, especially in the error handling segment. But at any rate, you see the success values here and the error response values here of the payload, and using where you can override the status code. So when in doubt of, gee, what was that? You look at the HTTP kit, or the APIkit router. It will show you. Another thing real quick, while we're here looking at the router, is that you may have a question surrounding what essentially happens as a result of using a specification. Okay, so here's our specification. I'm going to cover this real quick. In that, for every method resource pair, there is one. Here is a second one. Here is a third. Oops, here is a third. There's the fourth, and there's the fifth. So in this specification, I have 5 method resource pairs. Okay, 5 method resource pairs. So in the APIkit router, what ends up being created is our main flow, our console flow, and then 5 private flows. 5 private flows, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for each of those method resource pairs. Okay, so do know that. Do know that when it comes to it, it'll create the 5 different endpoints. And look at these error handling options here that are set up for us. So coming down the list, this is, in our main flow, this is a stacked order of error handling. So we've got each of these on error propagate. If the type of error is the APIkit bad request, this will occur. This processor will run. If it's APIkit not found, APIkit method not allowed. So each of these are different error types. Okay, so these are also automatically created when we use the APIkit router. It's loaded with a bunch of error handling already. So when you're doing your error handling strategy, you need to remember that this is built in if you are using a specification as your interface. If you're using this to build out your interface for your Mule application, which is recommended, this is automatically populated. So for when you're doing your error handling strategy, this is already covered. So let's look at this transform message. And this is another little trick also. So let's say we had a method not allowed. We're trying to maybe delete all of our patients. Well, that would be bad. And we don't even have a delete under patients anyway, right? We have patients by ID. We're allowed to delete just one, but there's not a delete of all of the patients. We only have a get and a post. So if we look here, method not allowed, if this is going to provide 2 things here. We're using a transform message to do 2 different things here. One is in the payload to provide a meaningful message. Like in this case, you'll get a message that says method not allowed instead of just a server error, right? And then also if you click on the little arrow to the right of the payload and you can open this up, there's also a variable that's set here. And the name of that variable is HTTPStatus. So click on that and now we see the value of that HTTPStatus code is 405. So now we're going to actually get a more meaningful error message that makes sense for this type of error. Each one of these are set to a unique HTTPStatus code for the kind of error that it is. So the way to do this, if you've never done this before, by default, when you use the transform message, it'll automatically take you to where you can add your data weave code. Okay. And so what you would do is do the plus just next to the down arrow there, the little plus icon, and you would change this to variable and you would put the variable name here. And then it would add it as an additional variable. And then you could set the value of it. As we can see, just write the amount there. Okay, so this is, again, it's kind of like dual purpose of using the transform message and setting a variable all together as one. All right, and let's see, I think it's at this level that we do it. Yeah. At some point, we're doing the set. Here it is. Okay, so here is the 2-step process of setting the payload to a meaningful error message, and then also to set the HTTPStatus code here. So this is another way that you can do that, having 2 processors, or you could use the transform message and have it all together as one. Okay. So that portion may not be as exam relevant, but it will certainly, well, actually knowing how many flows are spun off and understanding your, the HTTP default versus the customization is very exam relevant. Okay. So I need to pause for just 1 second. I'm going to pause the recording. All right. So stepped away for just a minute. Next concept we're going to talk about in the objectives are the different kinds of error scopes. So we have a choice. We can either use on error propagate, which will throw a 500 server error if we use the on error propagate, unless we change the HTTP status here. But on error propagate basically the Mule Error Object, okay, the error type and the error description is being passed in the Mule event, and the client receives a 500 server error if you don't override it in here. Okay, the on error continue is the normal Mule message is being passed. There is not an error flag. There is not a Mule error flag there. So it's going to give a 200 success. But do be sure to note that in both cases, whether it's on error propagate or on error continue, that neither of these processors will run. Okay, even though in this case that we're returning a 200 error, it's still, these processors do not run. Okay, it's just a case where you might want to acknowledge that an error occurred, but that you do not want to completely stop the entire process of that flow, or I should say return back a 500 server error. Okay, so on error propagate scope and on error continue scope have different functionalities. And so we want to be aware of what those look like. We're going to run some examples here in just a few minutes. So we will see. You know what was not covered on here? Yeah, let's do this one. Let's go ahead and by now you should have your jar files running in Studio. Okay. And let me go to our first one here. I'm going to go ahead and run this. Yeah. Because the very first example we have is the behavior of the Mule default error handler. There's no error handling here at all. So when this one runs, as you will see, go ahead and get some kind of a client application running also. I will use Advanced REST Client. When we run this, we're going to see the behavior of the Mule default error handler. And it behaves very much like the on error propagate, because it just pretty much stops and returns back a 500 error. Okay, so we'll see it. And if you later, you can run these in debug mode, and you can actually watch them go through the process so you can really get a clear understanding of how it's behaving. But our first example is going to be the, and each one of these has the pathway for the listener, you know, included there. So let's go ahead and send in our first request. And my Advanced REST client is not all the way running yet. So let me give that a second. So there might be a time, this is not working, hang on. There might be a time where your result that you're getting for the exam result is showing the Mule default error handler, or that might be, you know, one of the options for an answer. You know, what will handle this error? Is it the Mule default error handler? And if there is no error handling in the scope here, then that's likely going to be the case. And then we want to know what that response is going to look like. And my Advanced REST client's not behaving. Let me get Postman. Okay. All right, here we go. All else fails, use Postman. So anyway, this one, I put in localhost 8081, example 1, and we can see the error message. That's the error message that we have set up in our raise error, and we're getting the 500 server error here. Okay, so holds true. And then we can look at our console and see the error message that is placed in the console itself. Okay, so that gives us an idea of how the Mule default error handler is behaving. We cannot manage that error in any way if we don't have any error handling here. Okay, nothing there. It's going to just basically throw that error. Now, if we have on error propagate, in this case, now we're going to get that 500 error. We don't override the values here. This is still set to the HTTP listener default settings. So that means essentially it's going to be set to the default settings, right? So now we'll go ahead and send in our request for example 2. And for example 2, we are still getting a 500 server error and the error description. So the behavior of the on error propagate is very much like the Mule default, even when we have values set here. And even though we have a set payload to error occurred, who can tell me why we're not seeing that error occurred here?
Your listener is not set to receive the payload under error description.
Excellent. That's right. That's exactly right. So don't let the exam trick you when it's saying as an option, your HTTP listener is set to default settings. And what are you going to get back? Payload? Know that. Yeah, perfect. That's exactly right. So we're getting the error description here because we have not overridden that. Good deal. Good deal. And now let's come to on error continue. Now remember again in the on error propagate, an error message and an error description, or I should say the error type and the error description have been created as an error object. Now when we run the third one, look at that, 200 and status error occurred. So let's take a look at this flow. And now we're getting the payload and we're getting a 200. Again, an error did occur. We clearly have an error, but now why are we getting the payload in this case?
Because on error continue is going to change your response over to 200. The code is changed over to 200. So that's going to allow a payload to come through.
Yep, exactly. Perfect. And even though we're still getting an error description here, because we are, because of it being exactly like you said, RJ, because it's a on error continue, we're getting that payload value. Yep. Very good. Very good. Very good. All right. And then we have over here somewhere on the far right that, yeah, this is the payload value here in that log coming out there. All right. Good, good. I think example 4 was
That's your first listener that you set to the customized error response. So you're going to have the payload set on that one.
Yeah. Okay. We didn't do status code override on that one though, did we? Yeah. Okay. And I think I also have it in this one. I think I start with 4. Yep, there we go. So this one in the next jar file, yeah, has it overridden. Yeah, so there is a number, example 4, that's in the error handling demystified that's not fully set up. So yeah, example 4 in the error handling application is set up with the default settings. Yep. Very good. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop the other flow from running. That one back out. Okay, so there is, I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit on these. We looked at the on error propagate, on error continue behavior, and there are 3 places that we can add error handling. We can add it to a flow, which we just saw. We can add it to a processor, which is the triscope wrapped around not just one, but multiple processors can be here. And then have error handling at that level, or our global error handler. So the next group of examples that we have are going to be, some are at the flow level still, and those are a result of looking at the difference between a parent and child. Now that's where some confusion starts to come in, is in, first of all, overriding the values. So let's go ahead and get this one running. We'll get that spun up. All right. And once this one has deployed, we can go ahead and send in, oh, look, this is now behaving. All right. Example 4. And now the first one that got sent in is no error handling here at all, but we do have the values over, customized, overridden in our responses, but we didn't have any error handling at all. So in this case, we're going to get a 500 server error, and we're going to get our message because we set a payload here. So let's think about what just happened. We come in through our listener. We set the payload with the correlation ID. We have a logger here, and then the error occurs. And this is kind of how you're going to see scenarios of the exam questions be. Like you've got certain things going on, this is happening, and then you have an error. What's your response going to be? If we have the error response set to payload, we're going to get this payload value. So really analyze if it's been, a default setting of the HTTP listener, or if it's customized as a standard here that you see, and when the error occurred and what's set. Because in our case, now we are getting this message. Okay, we are getting that message. So that does make a difference, even though we're still getting the 500 server error because we did not set the HTTP status variable. It's, if nothing's been set, then you will get a 500 server error, and we're getting the payload, of where it was last, that value of it last. And also in the console, you're going to have a payload. There's the error message there. And right before the error, we should also have that status flow started correlation ID logger. And so error, and in error handling, when we didn't have, I'm going to kind of share my age a little bit here, but years ago, we didn't have debuggers. We had code that had to be compiled. Some languages still do that. And so you really didn't have the ability to step through your flows like we do in Mule or in some of the other programming languages and see those values along the way. So what we would do is we heavily use loggers. And so you can see that carries over. I heavily use loggers. And you can set those loggers to different log levels. So if you look at a logger, you can set the different log levels to be at a debug level. Okay. So you can see it at runtime. If you bring the level of your logs to be shown by default, info level logs are shown in Cloud Hub. So if you wanted to see the debug level logs, you would have to set it to debug level. So those are, loggers will help you to see what's going on with your application too. So anyway, in this case, again, we have nothing happening in the error handling, but because we've changed the HTTP listener, we can start to see we're getting more information. And so we're going to compound it even more as we come down. There are ways also to catch a certain error. And in this case, in example 5, we are raising an any type error. And so we have this set to catch an any type error. And let me open this guy back up again. In our application where the HTTP, where the APIkit router is used. And this is a stack of error handling scopes. Okay. So in the case I just showed you the flow of, we had the top one, we have one that's set to any. So it's going to catch any error. In the case of multiple stacked scopes, you want to have your specific type at the top and then your broader type at the bottom. So the any essentially would be at the bottom. So it's kind of like a filter. It's going to run through, and any errors, as soon as it finds a match, that error handling scope will be invoked. Okay, so if you had all of these stacked and an any at the bottom, that any would be whatever's left. Okay, so that makes a difference on, in this case, we have any, and then we're going to go ahead and set have it run these two processors for error handling. So if we send in example 5, you're going to get back the actual error message this time. Okay, because we set the payload here. Okay, we set the payload here. And you can see in that set payload, we have status error occurred and then the error description. We went ahead and included the error description. Okay, so there's the error description there. So again, basic elements. Now, if it doesn't match, so in this case, on example 6, we're doing the raise error of any type, but it's not going to match. Watch how this behaves now. Let's send in 6. Okay. Now, what it did do, if there's no match, even if you have error handling, what it does, the behavior of it is the Mule default error handler is invoked. So it came through, an error is raised, it did not match, so then the Mule default error handler is thrown. And that's why in this case, we're getting the original, remember, the very first one gave us this message. It's given us the payload, but it's giving us the payload based on the set payload value here. No match, these don't run. That's probably one of the trickiest things about the error handling, if you don't have a match. So there are times that you do want to have error handling in your flow, and you want to manage that error handling here, but just make sure that if you remember that if you do not have a match, that is going to just throw the Mule default error handler, and these will not run. So you may want to have another any here or whatever you're wanting to capture. Okay. On error continue. Let's run number 7. Okay. And we're going to get back, even though we did not set any HTTP status code because it's on error continue, we're getting this back and we're getting the payload. Okay, we're getting a 200 okay, we're getting the payload value back. Again, it returns back the Mule message. It does create the error object, but because it's a 200, it's like, it's okay. There's not an error on the play. It's not going to, stop. But these two did not run. These two did not run. And again, there's a no match. It's going to behave similarly. Let's go ahead and run 8. Okay, 8. And we're going to get the payload of the flow started, correlation ID. So that's the Mule default error handler because that did not match the any. No match. All right. And now parent-child. Okay, this is going to get a little tricky on parent-child. And these are really good. I'm not going to do it for watching our time, but these are really good to run in debug mode to really see where it's going to hop. So come back through and practice this more. But on a parent flow, what will happen here is we're going to come through and we're going to flow reference to our child flow. Okay, so that means we're going to come down here to our child flow. And then here we have an error. Okay, so this error occurs and it goes to the error handler. And in this error handler, it will return back after both of these run. It's on error propagate, so it's going to be returning back the error object. And it comes back here. And then when it returns back to the parent flow, it's carrying that error object. And so it's going to say, oh, we had an error. So now it's going to run this on error propagate and return this back to the listener. Okay. So it's almost like double error handling happening here. Double error handling. And as it runs through this and we see this whole process, really what we're going to see is how it manages the set payload on an on-error propagate. Let's run example number 9. Okay. And so when this whole thing ran, which set payload do you think is going to be reflected in our response? An error occurred in the child or an error occurred in the parent? Which one's going to be reflected?
It'll be the last payload that it got if your HTTP listener is set up to receive payload.
Okay, and it is. These are all set to that. So you think it's going to be an error occurred in the parent flow, or is it going to be what message? Error occurred in parent or child?
I think it's going to be parent. I think it's going to be the last payload that it received.
Okay. Manny and Finn, what do you think?
Same. I was thinking it'd be the parent as well.
Okay, and it is. It is. Okay, so when we are managing our error handling and there's an on-error propagate in the child, it's going to rethrow that message, that error. It kind of will flag the error object and send back an error object. And therefore, this will process. This will be your last thing that processes. Okay. But what if the child has an on-error continue? Okay, what if there's an on-error continue here? Let's see what happens on example 10. And in this case, and again, run them in debug mode. It's pretty cool to see them. But in this case, it should have come in. If we can run the theory of it, let's run the theory part, and then we'll see what our result is. Theory would be our flow reference comes down to our child flow. an error occurs here, we set the payload here, and this returns back with an error message, but it's an on error continue, an on error continue. And so what's going to happen is there is not an error message flagged. This does not run because it does not detect that there is an error, and this runs and this runs. Okay. Now, some people may say, well, why would you do that? Let's double check against our response here on example 10. And we are getting the message that the flow completed. And here's your correlation ID. So it actually did complete this set payload here. And it ignored essentially that there was an error down here. When might this be really helpful in an error handling strategy?
I'm imagining like if the payload that you wound up receiving is just so important, it doesn't matter what error is thrown, you have to get that status complete correlation ID maybe.
Yeah, let's say we're flow referencing down to a couple different child flows down here. And this is something we do in the fundamental class, right? You go and you flow reference to 3 other flows through a choice router. We go to 3 other flows and we run through that process, and one of the flight's website is down. So we have other data. You're right, RJ. We have other data that we want to provide in that payload. And sorry, Delta's out of commission because their site's down, but we want to continue to return American and United flight data. So yeah, you're right. There's times when our payload may have other information. In our case of this simple example, it's a correlation ID. And we want to at least provide that information back and complete the flow. So if this is not critical information, or another strategy would be, let's say that, you know, that this database is down, but we have a static file as of last night with data in it, flat file, or we have maybe a cache, we might have some data in the object store, and all that is managed in this on error continue to provide some information back, and we want to set the payload to wherever else we might be getting this data from in an error handling strategy. And we return this back and we say, yeah, keep going, you're okay. And it completes the flow with the static data instead of the live data from the database. And at least we're providing something back for them. And we might have a notation on here somewhere that says, as of midnight last night, or, you know, database is down. This is a static list, you know, as of, you know, a certain time frame. But that way you have a error handling strategy applied to providing some data back. And then the parent flow completes out and it's happy. It's got something. Like you said, there's some valuable data that has to be sent. And so this information comes back in through your HTTP listener. So good. But I want you to be thinking, as you're looking at each of these scenarios, I want you to be thinking about how you would apply it in an error handling strategy. And that's what we're going to talk about on Thursday, is the error handling strategy. So parent-child, it would not matter whatever. This could be on error propagate. It could be on error continue. It doesn't matter. If this one's returning back a 200, then it's going to continue running, right? It doesn't matter what this is. It could be anything. That's why you'll see in some of the example in the documentation that I have that goes with this, and I'll upload that. I've got some blogs that I wrote on all of this. And so you'll see it doesn't matter if it's on error propagate or on error continue in this area. Okay. But it would matter if this was on error, if the child had on error propagate, that would behave differently. All right. Overriding the status code. Now this is where we get into changing the status code here. Our status code gets changed to 400. Okay. So let's run 11. And you can see the behavior of this one. Now it's being more meaningful. An error occurred. And guess what? It is a 400 or whatever the error is. You know, in the HTTP status codes, there's a whole library of different error types there. Okay. And so all of that would have a bearing on, you know, whatever you really want to have back as a message. And notice that in the we didn't set that portion of it on our HTTP listener. When there is some default values for the reason phrases here. So we did not set the reason phrase. The reason phrase is being picked up as a result of the actual code itself. Okay, the status code has a default name or reason phrase. You can override that as well. We just don't ever do it in our examples. But if you wrote a reason phrase here or wanted to also have something defined as your reason phrase, you could do the same thing. You could have a variable set up as a reason phrase, and depending on what that reason phrase is in your flow, you could handle adding the reason phrase. Okay, so you could set another variable or use the transform message and set a reason phrase also. Okay, so that can be managed. This value right here on the bad request can be managed. It's picking up a default value for that though. Okay. So we can see in that case, like I said, it's more meaningful. We're getting our payload back as we set our payload. So all of that is behaving as expected. All right. If you guys have any questions or anything along the way, let me know. I'm just kind of covering all of these details here. All right. In this case now, we have the try scope. So this is looking at using error handling at the processor level. And it could be many processors here. I don't want you to think that, oh, you can only use one processor or anything like that. But no, there are many that you could use there. Hang on a second. I'm trying to get to my other window here, because I want to go back to this. Okay. So we've talked about the flows, the parent-child flows, which would mean also your main flow, your private flows. In that category, do remember that your private flows have error handling in it. So our child flows here have error handling because it's like a flow, but it's got error handling. If you use a subflow, there is no error handling in it. No error handling in a subflow. Only a private flow. And a private flow is a flow that does not have a source because you can't access it from externally. So that means that you can only access it from a flow that does have a source. Okay. So again, that's your regular flow you're seeing, your private flow that does have error handling, and then a subflow that does not have error handling. So if you had a subflow, your error handling is included in the wherever it's referenced to. So if an error occurs in a subflow, wherever it originated from is going to be where the error handling will live. Okay. Triscope. All right, so now this is, it's listed in our scopes over here. It's a triscope, and you can put it around a group of processors. And if an error occurs, then the error handling you have set here will be invoked. Now you can use this also that if an error occurs along the way of this process, is going to pretty much roll back what you have done in that triscope. There's different things you can set here. Okay. So there are different settings on the triscope. And if an error occurs, these error handling scopes will be invoked. If it's an on error continue, it's going to keep flowing. Okay. It's going to keep flowing. And that is set in this case to any. All right. But because it's an on error continue of any, it's going to continue processing. So let's run example 12. Okay. And it went right on through to complete the flow, 200 okay. Okay, so that went all the way through. An error did occur. It was any kind of error for that to capture. And then it hit this set payload here and complete it out. Now, if we look at our console, we're going to see that an error did in fact occur. And we can see what the logger posted out too. Error occurred, error description. There it is. And then we also have the logger that it completed, because it did in that case bypass and continue processing here. So this never ran. It just kind of came all the way through. Okay. And you can do different modifications of this, change this to another kind of error. So you can do different modifications and change it around a little bit. Yeah. All right, and the final one, kind of running out of time here a little bit, keeping an eye on our time here. Our final one is the global. And so in the case of the global error handler, let me stop this guy from running. Now, a couple things on this is that in the global error handler, when you set your global XML file, so you have to have a global XML file set up, this is where your error handling is going to, your error handling scope is going to live. So if we go to core, this is going to be your error handler. You can, in the case of this example, have multiple error handlers defined. I do it for testing and education, but you choose only one in your global elements that will actually be used. So under our configuration in your global XML, this is the one that is chosen to be used. Ultimately, I wouldn't have all of those different error handling scopes there in a production application, but for testing purposes, I have it where you can change the different error handling scopes. Okay, so you can try different scenarios here. And that's what is listed here. Oh, not there. Yeah, our different error handling scopes by the name at the top. Okay, so what's going to happen essentially is that a flow is going to run, and you can run it in debug mode like this and watch it hop over to the global error handler to manage that error. Okay, and for each of these, and I'm not going to run them. It gets a little complex when with a child also and the global error handler, but there's various things that you can see in its behavior. But you will find that in most cases, we will use a global error handler unless you want an error handler closer to ignoring an issue like we saw here, and we saw in the child. Like, we know there's an error, but we're going to provide you back with some data. Okay, so that's a strong strategy right there. So one other thing I want to mention, I'm going to have RJ explain the chart that he's got. It's really great. And that is error mapping. We have an example of a validation check on a payload. And if we had validation checks on our data at various places, you may have 5 or 6 or more, who knows, different kinds of checking the payloads like this here. Okay. And so in this case, where we have validation on a payload, it's going to come back with a Boolean, true or false in this case. So instead of having this set to a, invalid Boolean message or type of error, we want to map this particular one. So if I had like 5 different flows, I could have each one mapped to something specific in this particular flow and map it to a custom error type. And so that's what this is showing, where we can map over instead of it being an invalid Boolean generic kind of a message that doesn't mean too much to us in our logs and in our messages, we can map it to something specific. So that's what that is showing, is your error mapping. That's very helpful also. Okay. So that's kind of like your brushes and your paint, okay, of applying it. Now, RJ, I'm going to let you take it from here and tell me how this has really been helpful for you.
Yeah, so I didn't design this. Whoever did design it, a huge shout out and a thank you, giving credit where it's due, wherever you are. Thank you for making this. When I was going through the flows that Digital D shared, I was just doing like she said. I was just practicing. I was changing things up. I was, switching things from on error continue over to on error propagate. Just I wanted to see what it would do. I wanted to try them all out and get an idea of what was going to happen. And I came across this diagram that's on screen, and this helped me big time. I try not to commit too many things to memory because, I just want to store up in my brain what I really need. Well, this diagram was one thing that I went ahead and committed it to memory. It was worth it to me. So at the very top here, we see where an error occurs. So right out the gate, it drops down into the question that Digital D was covering: is this in a subflow? If it is, then it's going to pass it back to the main flow, dropping down with the answer yes. And then dropping down further, we can see what it will do. The F in the circle there represents in a flow. So now we're coming over a little bit to the next question: is the error scope defined? And this one, it got me a couple times when I was practicing around and seeing this question on quizzes, because I didn't really know when the Mule default error handler would kick in and when it wouldn't. I knew it was there, but I didn't really understand like what's going to happen. Is global going to pick this up? Is my error handler that I put down below my flow going to pick it up? Well, this diagram just clears it up for me. It drops down. Is the error scope defined? Yes. So if it is defined, it drops down and asks the next question, because we have to ask this. And this is helpful when I was running through these. It got my memory going, because I was thinking, okay, we have an expression error. Is our error handler going to handle that? So the question, correct error type. If it is, then it handles the error. We're kind of clear on that. But for me, what I wound up seeing this diagram helping me remember was that if it's not the correct error type, then you jump over to the right, and that is where the Mule default error handler jumps in and handles it for us. The error type didn't match up, so it's gonna kick in. And then of course, as Digital D was describing, you have to check and see what your Mule default error handler is set as, in order to understand what your outcome, what your feedback is going to be. And that, while I'm on this topic, I want to go ahead and address how important it was to me learning, because I'm still learning to this very day. I was then going into the XML and getting used to and familiar to seeing what that XML code looked like on my HTTP listener, it's really easy for me to click on the HTTP listener flow and see my error response. But went ahead and now I can look at that XML code, and I'm not an XML guru, but I think, yep, she's jumping over there now. When I see that, when I look at that, I know what that HTTP listener is set as, because I recognize that XML code. And that's also something that apparently is on the quiz. I've not ever seen the quiz, but I've heard that they will give you an XML example. So that's why I like seeing that, and it's real life too.
Yeah,
There
that's
it
true.
is. There it is right there. So yeah, we saw the XML code. So then back up to flow, and at the very top F in the circle will now drop down, and we'll go across the line here, and we'll see, is an error scope defined. Now jumping over, we're going to pretend there's not one and say no. We'll see now that our global error handler is going to now kick in. So this, again, the diagram kind of just justifies in my mind who's picking up this error and why they're picking it up. So now we're over on the global error handler. And if there is one, we'll say, yes, there is. Is it the correct error type? Again, we're checking, is it an any type error? Is it a Boolean? Is it an expression? What is it? If it's the correct type, obviously, then your global error handler handles it. If it's not the correct type, then again, we now see the Mule default error handler handling it. And again, if the global error handler does not even exist, if there's not one, then your default error handler gets it. That was a huge help to me. And again, a shout out to the author and designer of this. Thank you, because this has been a huge help.
Yeah, I wonder who created it. I've seen an instructor use this. I wonder if it was, there's an instructor called Matthew Thurman, and he used something like this. I wonder if it's his.
It may be. Tried looking and researching and seeing where I found it in a internet search. I couldn't find out who designed it. I just wanted to give him a thumbs up, but couldn't figure anything out. But that's okay.
I'll send it to him privately because he had something similar to it. If it's not his, I'd be really surprised. But yeah, this is really good. This is really good. And it's good to see, like, after you've tried all the scenarios, you've looked at all the scenarios, so it really makes sense. You know, is it that's the type we're looking for? If it's not, there's your Mule default error handler right there. Boom, it hits you. Yeah. Are you guys okay to go just a few more minutes, or anyone have a hard stop?
I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. There's a few example questions. Okay. So what do you think the correct answer is? Put it in the chat for me. What are you going to get off of this one? Okay. Remember that the listener is set to default settings. Listener set to default settings. And you could run it to see for yourself. But the correct answer is A. It is A, because there is no error handling, and it is the Mule default error handler that's going to set it. And we should get the error description. Let me run that one again and make sure that that answer is correct. Hang on. That is in this one. So be sure. All right, so it's deployed. Drum roll. Let's check it to be sure. This one is number 1.
I was probably reading that wrong, but I was thinking that C was the error description, since
Error
that's
description.
what the error default would give back.
Let's see. On this. Raise error any type. Yeah, so we are getting something back in the answer should be more specific. It is A. But if we look at our we are getting the error description. The error description. So C is not right because it would not be raise error any type. Wait, let me make sure I've got that right. This should be more descriptive because raise error any type. Mostly to point out that it would not give it's giving the error description. So I can see why you would have chosen C, guys. So I wouldn't be too upset about that. But we do want to make sure you got this part, the server error. So Finn has got it with the server error because it would be a 500 server error. Make sense? Didn't mean to trick you on that one. It should be a little clearer.
No,
Let's see.
I guess my mind was going to what did they set that raise error description to? Yeah, I don't know where I was going completely, but yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah. And in here, basically want to point out that the Mule default error handler is just going to give you this. It will give you the error description though. Okay, because of the default settings on the listener. So you will in the body get the error description. And that would be something to put up here under A is the error description. Something like that. All right. What's the result of this one? Got a couple B's. And B is the correct answer. Yeah. And primarily because you're on error continue right here. Remember when you get that, it's going to just continue on. Continue on. And then for the final one in the error handling category. And I guess really running this one will convince you. And why you would do this, I'm not quite sure, but it is one of the example questions and it is in the fundamental curriculum. Okay, so it's kind of a trick question. First of all, what do you notice in the XML code?
I think Diane, so this rise error will rise the error and this on propagate will catch. But here we are setting the HTTP status variable as 200. Maybe even though it's a error, so maybe 200 will come there. So I think the error and we are setting payload as like error occurred. Let's see how it runs. And
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of, we've got the HTTP status code. Do we know if that listener is set to the default settings or if it's set to customize?
we are setting payload there. So it payload, let's see.
So we see the code here for the listener. Watch for this. So we know that it is overridden, right? This means that that listener, even though you don't see the configuration of the listener, if you have the XML code, this is going to tell us that, yes, we are overriding those values. And so even though this is you're right, even though this is an on-error propagate, and we set the payload, when we set the status code to 200, it's going to return a 200 status with the payload value of an error occurred. Yeah. Yeah. So it is even because you've overridden the HTTP status code here. So it is C. C is the correct, or I'm sorry, D is the correct answer. Run that.
Wow. Yeah, I need to do that. I see
Run
that
that.
now.
Yeah, because we override the even though this is an on-error propagate, and I honestly do not know when we would ever do this, but it is in the course material of the fundamentals, and there potentially could be questions surrounding that. So you can even take an on-error continue and change the HTTP status code to 500, and it's going to behave like an on-error propagate. Crazy stuff. But so you can, whatever that status code is how your HTTP listener is going to handle the behavior there. All right. Okie doke. So Thursday. Thursday, we are going to open up starting off with error handling strategy. No, you know what? We're not going to start with error handling strategy. Let's start with routers. I'll do a segment on routers. And then what I want you to do is then we'll go into the error handling strategy. And I say that because you can use routers as part of your error handling strategy. Okay, so I'm going to also give you this routers jar file for you all to run and get familiar with it. I'm sure you have, but what's in here also, and you can see your endpoints for each one. There's a choice router, scatter gather, round robin that we rarely use. I don't think I've ever used it, but first successful is very big when it comes to managing errors, because it will actually throw, if there's an error in the route, it goes to the next route. So this is a good example of if this database is down, go to the next one, go to the next strategy. It's a good example of redundancy. So there is error handling a segment in here, or not a segment, but a way to manage. So I'm going to go ahead and export this as well and put this in the chat or in the Slack channel. So anyway, that's kind of it for today. Any questions or comments before we wrap? All good? All right. Now, when I talk about error handling strategy, what I want you to do is be thinking and then share how you would take maybe a system API that you have and how you would apply error handling to it. What would your strategy be? That's what I'm looking for. So we'll talk about that. We'll go over some different possibilities and how we can do some strategies from there. All right. So we'll see you next segment.